Hey everyone, good afternoon. This is AJ Ehrenstein, Dean of Beyond Barnard. It's day 4 of this week-long introduction to the consulting industry, and we're finally at cases. We've made it to what I think is one of the most distinctive parts of the consulting recruiting process. Although, as we'll talk about a little bit today, cases show up in other recruiting processes as well. And I think my big takeaway for you all in this, or at least in my thinking about cases and in this presentation, I guess a little bit, is that thinking through cases, thinking like a consultant, can be useful no matter what kind of challenge or project you're engaged in. So my pitch to you would be that practicing cases and getting good at thinking like you're a consultant when you're in the context of leadership roles in extracurricular activities, when you're thinking about managing long-term projects, when you're tackling a kind of logistical problem and you're kind of, I think about like moving as a consulting problem. I think about like finding a new apartment as a consulting problem. There are ways in which some of the things that we'll talk about, some of the frameworks that you can bring to bear on problems can have applications in lots of really surprising ways. So as always, I'd like to encourage students that if you're interested in business cases, then think about getting some exposure to them. They're really easy to get exposure on outside of the classroom. And they're really a cool way to learn about different industries. So I think one of the common complaints, maybe not complaints, I don't know, one of the common observations about a liberal arts education, kind of qua liberal arts education, is that you don't spend a lot of time thinking about industries and business practices. And to me, a liberal arts kid and the deep core of my soul, I'm totally fine with that. But I do think that there are many opportunities to learn about how business works outside of the strict confines of the classroom. And that then you can think about how to bring the critical thinking, writing, communications, leadership, coordination, collaboration, all of the skills that you are developing in the classroom to bear on this other body of knowledge that you can develop. That's my intro spiel, and I'm sticking to it. So really briefly, where have we been? We are all the way here on day 4. We did an intro to consulting on Monday. We talked about resume and cover letter best practices on Tuesday. Yesterday, we talked primarily about building up your network and thinking about how to plan for both behavioral and informational interviews. And today, we'll talk about cases. The learning objectives, however, remain the same for the week. Review them on your own time. I've been sending the presentations each evening. But today, when it comes to case interviews, I have 3 very straightforward goals. I hope that you'll be able to develop a strategy for approaching and cracking case interviews. And really, I think about cases in general, not just case interviews, but to think about the structure of business cases and problems. I want to encourage you to connect with each other to practice cases. And I added this one. This is not on the goals for the week, but I was putting this together last night. And I was just thinking, maybe if we get through this together, if you watching at home after the event, hopefully you feel a little bit less stressed about what case interviews are, how to prepare for them, and potentially how to do really well in them. So our agenda for today, first, what are case interviews? Why do firms use case interviews to begin with? Then I'll launch into actually cracking cases, some initial steps, and we'll walk through a kind of jokey example case that I've cooked up that I've loved to use over the last few years, and I'll save time for questions. So first, what are cases? What is a case interview? And I hope that I'm not the only one who's seen Jurassic Park. I feel like I need to update my movie references at some point, but I do feel like Jurassic Park is still relatively safe. Case interview, and you'll see why I've introduced this iconic image from the very first Jurassic Park that scared the pants off of me in like 1995 or whenever it was. But case interviews are at first puzzles that can seem ridiculously vague. So here's an example of a business case. A multinational biogenetics startup has devised a novel technology for reintroducing extinct animals into the environment. Help them to determine whether there's a market for a theme park based on this technology, anticipating possible risks and rewards. In other words, this is the business case for Jurassic Park. So the challenge for a case interviewee is to ask probing questions about this case to help the client get to an answer to their question. The question here being, should the client should the client open a theme park based on the technology that they have created? And what are some of the risks and rewards of that potential project? You'll ask probing questions to approach some sort of solution to this question, to this bigger question. So they can be solved by using any number of frameworks. And if you've investigated consulting case interviews at all, you may have already come upon the F word, frameworks. Frameworks are very simply rubrics, or think of them as functions if you're a math whiz, or algorithms, or ways of approaching problems that help those problems break into their constituent parts. At the same time, even though you're called upon to use frameworks, case interviews tend to require individuals to think flexibly within frameworks. So I'll talk about this a little bit more, but your objective is not to apply framework X to problem Y, ka-chunk. It's instead to have a good sense of different ways that business problems operate, and to use that general knowledge to then break open cases through your own kind of independent mobilization of that knowledge about how businesses work. Because I think above all, case interviewers, consultants in particular, are looking for evidence of your capacity to develop logical thinking. They want to see clear approaches to problems. In many ways, this is akin to when you were in, let's say, 5th grade, and your teacher gave you word problems. And it didn't always matter that you got the right answer, but it did matter that you always showed your work. You're supposed to show the case interviewer how you are approaching a problem, how you are getting to a potential solution. And if you've done that effectively, then it matters less that you get the exact right answer that they were expecting than the fact that you move through the case in a logical, methodical way. This should spur creative and thoughtful discussion between you and the case interviewer. So unlike the behavioral interview that we were talking about yesterday, where your goal is to really have a conversation about you, I think the reputation of case interviews is it's you are being tested by the person who's delivering the case. And I would push back and say, actually, when case interviews are done at their best, the interviewee is keeping the case interviewer involved, helping them understand how their thinking is evolving, keeping it more like a conversation between a consultant and a client instead of between an interviewer and an interviewee. And okay, there's also some math. Now listen, when we talk about the math that's required in a case interview, we're not talking about the kind of math that's going to require a slide rule. And most often, what case interviewers are actually interested in seeing is that you have the ability to stay calm under pressure. So you're not going to need to memorize your 3, 4, 5 triangles. You're not going to need to know complex equations in order to do the math that's required of case interviews. It tends to be a huge source of anxiety, though. And my colleague Greg Triandis often suggests that students who are going through the case process think about math throughout the day. Try to round your tip up. Try to look through the newspaper and take a look at millions and billions in revenue numbers and say, okay, well, the 2x that revenue would be this. Try to understand big, kind of general numbers, like what's the population of the United States? About 325 million. What's the population of the globe? It's about 7.5, I think. Is it 8? 7.5? 7.5, 8. Okay, somewhere there. I don't. Again, and 1,000 times. I'm not a consultant. But no kind of big trends, no kind of big numbers. You don't have to get down into the nitty gritty of things. So I would really encourage you to kind of destabilize this notion that you need to be a math whiz to crack cases. Okay, in a case interview, what is an interviewer's role first and foremost? So the interviewer is supposed to mete out information. They will have a sheet of paper in front of them, or if they're virtual, they might just be looking at their screen, that has different types of information that they can give to you that will help you navigate your way through the case. Their job then is to act as an interlocutor with you as you try to get that information out of them. So you have essentially a withholding client, a client that has a body of knowledge, and it's your job in the interview as a potential consultant to get that information out of the client. In the process, the interviewer is supposed to push back and probe your language, probe your approach. They may tell you, no, that's not right. They may invite you to clarify and challenge your assumptions. So if you say, well, I'm going to assume that the population is about 600 million in the United States, they might say, okay, why are you assuming that? They are supposed to find weaknesses in your argument to help your argument be stronger. They are supposed to find inaccurate estimations and say, wait, tell me about how you got there. Because it was really their job to keep you on track, to figure out if your methodology for approaching a case can get you towards a right answer. They are assessing your ability to think quickly, precisely, and calmly. I don't have calmly on there, but more and more over the years, I'm really thinking that one of the most important things in a consulting interview that you can convey is your capacity to stay measured and calm, to not feel flustered even if you make a mistake, because you will likely make a mistake at some point during these case interviews. And what they want to judge is if you are going to be put in front of a client at 23 years old as an entry-level consultant out of college, will you have the maturity and the capacity to listen to feedback, to hear you're wrong and say, okay, let me rethink this. Let me step back and think about my methodology to see if we can come up with a path forward. Their job is not necessarily to be nice. And I've definitely heard of kind of stress case interview scenarios where consultants will, pretend to be distracted. They'll actually take out their phone and scroll and say, I'm sorry, where are you at this case? Where are you? It doesn't happen very often, but it's an example of they're playing a role. They're trying to figure out how they can fluster you. Will you get flustered if they pretend to be distracted? Or will you say, hey, you know what, listen, it seems like you have an important email. I'm going to let you take care of that for a moment. I'm going to sit back just for a moment. Let me know if you'd like me to continue. A very professional way to respond to someone who's being actively rude in an interview scenario. So what is your role? So I'm just going to lay these all out. So the first is to understand the facts of the case. And I put this at the very top because it tends to be one of the things that students miss when they first begin doing cases. The first part of a case interview, and we'll go through the method, how they actually take place, is the interviewer will read out a list of facts. It's your job to understand those facts and get them right, because then you're going to produce some basic assumptions to begin the case. And if you get the facts wrong, if you don't repeat the facts correctly, then you're going to get the wrong assumptions and you're already off to a bad start. So throughout, your job is to stay calm, to show confidence not only in your assumptions, but also in the logic that you've laid out. At the same time, you need to narrate how you're moving through that thinking. You need to tell them what your process is, keeping the interviewer involved and responding to feedback as it's delivered to you. And this is the way that the case interview becomes more like a conversation than an interrogation. Saying things like, does that sound reasonable to you? Or next, I think I'm going to look at revenues. And my assumption would be that revenues comes from these three sources. Are there any other sources that you can tell me about? Keeping the interviewer involved and letting them know where you're moving will not only make the interview flow better, it will also key up the interviewer to say, you know what, that's not right. Let's go this way instead. Or that sounds reasonable to me. Let's proceed. You're looking for these cues throughout a case interview to understand whether your logic is correct and you can continue to move forward, or whether you're getting yourself into trouble. Now, you should be able to arrive at a solution. And sure, getting the right answer is important and nice. But really what they're looking for is your capacity to present that solution professionally based on the conclusions that you've arrived at through a logical progression of thinking. Just like if you're with a client, you need to present your solution succinctly in a manner that a client can actually understand, in a manner that gives them confidence that you as the consultant have come up with a good, solid conclusion. And throughout, I think these two things together are important. And I think this is important for Barnard students. It's important for lots of folks, but you all are smart. You all are used to being right. In lots of different scenarios. And it's important in case interviews to know that your objective is not to get your way, because very often the client is going to be right. The client is going to be the one driving the bus. And so the more you say, listen, this is unreasonable, this is the right way to go, That's not something you should be saying in a case interview. You shouldn't be exerting expertise or authority. If the interviewer says, this seems wrong, tell me how you got there, and you say, this is just an assumption, and I think it's important to move forward this way. It's flashing red, that's sirens. It shouldn't be part of your vocabulary. And the last part is not to just simply merely apply frameworks, as I've alluded to already. This will get clearer as we start to talk about frameworks, what they are in just a second. I'm going to give you my favorite simple 101 framework. Profitability equals revenue minus costs is a consulting framework. It's a straightforward, this is what every business is about. Every business in a capitalist system is about profiting, and profit is the total amount of money that that business makes, and what's subtracted is the cost that it incurs in making that revenue. There are complications beyond this. Costs are fixed and variable. Fixed costs do not change based on how much of a product you make. Variable costs do change. In other words, maybe you need more machinery if you make more coffee cups. Maybe you need more labor in order to produce more, I'm really hydrated, water bottles. Those are variable costs. Fixed costs are the land that you own, the size of the factory that's already in place. They can't change. So there are things that you need to know within these frameworks, but there are tons of them. Product, price, place, and promotion, or the 4 Ps. This is a great framework for thinking about marketing cases. Like, what is our product? What price point are we selling it at? Where do we place this product? In other words, where do we position it to which kinds of consumers, and how do we promote it? It's also good for a market entry. So a market entry problem would be something like a pharmaceutical company has developed a new COVID vaccine. Help this client figure out how to position its vaccine for a very large, very large potential customer base. Customer, cost, competition, and capabilities, also known as the 4 Cs. I've also seen the 5 Cs. I've seen the 3 Cs. If you Google these things, there are a bunch in the consulting case folder that Bjorn Barnard has shared, but there's tons of different ways of thinking through problems using these frameworks. And getting to know a few of them, getting to know which ones you like, which ones help you see through a lot of different kinds of problems, because the 4 Cs can be used to approach many different types of problems, as can the 4 Ps, as can be the 5 Qs or whatever it is. The point is to get inside some of these frameworks and to think about which ones help you get through problems the most efficiently. In other words, get used to the terms and learn what works for you. This is the raptor trying to get into the kitchen. Only Amy's on camera today, and so I'm not sure if like you've seen Jurassic Park, but I'm like, oh my God, Jurassic Park needs to maybe change. I have to pick a different movie. But so get used to the terms in the cases and learn which of the terms you will feel most comfortable with using. Okay, why cases? So case interviews examine your ability to think systematically and to communicate that process live. So your capacity to shift in response to information, your response to pressure. And so above all, they are a simulation of the kind of work, the problems you'll face, the incomplete information that clients have access to, the decision-making that you need to make based on evidence, and the responses to dead ends, bad leads, bad information that you will be doing as a consultant. So in other words, they're simply simulations of the work you will do. The question that I have for you all is, what can you get out of them? So first, if you like cases, if you really see them as problems and not as stressful endeavors, then you might actually like being a consultant. So one of the very reasons to practice consulting is to come up with your own specific reason as to why this work is interesting to you. So if you're in the position where you still kind of don't understand what a consultant does, you're not really sure why you're interested in it, except a lot of people seem to be attracted to the job, do cases. Cases are a great simulation for the kinds of problems that consultants face. Do you like these things? Do you not like them? It's really good evidence, if you're answering the former, that this work might be for you. As I said at the top, cases can help you approach many other kinds of problems. Let's say you're a student leader on student government and you are looking to plan a big event virtually. The problem might be that you're worried about driving attendance to a very large event in the context of COVID. So approach that like, I could see that as a framework here. We could use potentially customer, cost, competition, and capabilities. So how would I use this framework? Customer here is the people you want actually coming to the event. Costs might be the costs associated with getting a bigger Zoom account so that your student organization can accommodate a bigger event. Competition might be other events that are happening in a particular evening. Who are you competing against for the attention of other students? And what are your capabilities as an organization? What capabilities do you have to bring to bear? What great speakers? What fancy technologies? What pitch do you have for students to attend your event versus others? You can use a consulting framework to break down problems that you might be facing in the context of your everyday lives as students. Okay, so this is the meat of it. And I want to spend the remaining time talking about essentially how to crack cases. What do you expect when you go into a case interview? Typically, case interviews begin with introductions and fit questions that we talked about yesterday. And this is one of the reasons why I say that it's always important to have your value proposition, your elevator pitch down, because even case interviews at big firms will begin with some sort of behavioral component. The case then will typically go from 20 to 40 minutes. And I think to prep for that, you should get familiar with the diversity of problems that are within the universe of cases. Read casebooks, obviously. Think about the cases that are on firm websites. And know that the length and the shape of cases can be determined based on the particular firm and the round. You can always ask folks at Beyond Barnard, what does Capco typically do in their second round of interviews? And we have feedback from other students who've actually participated in those kinds of scenarios. Then there'll be a wrap-up. Sometimes you have the opportunity to ask questions. Sometimes firms will give you the opportunity to get feedback on your case performance right there. And as I talked about yesterday, asking informed questions about the firm, its culture, cases, career paths, etc., can be really helpful. Before cases, though, before you actually go to your interview, remember that it's always acceptable to ask for details. So if you get invited to an interview from a recruiter, let's say, you can email that recruiter and say, I'm really excited to take part. Are there any details you can share? You'd want to know if you're actually participating in a group case where you're going to be evaluated on your capacity to solve a problem with other people. Firms have moved to this as one potential option for case interviews. So here you're not being judged individually. You're instead in a room with 3 to 5 people, and your objective is to get a problem solved together while being observed by an interviewer or two. You may have a written case where you're given a certain amount of time, let's say 30 minutes. Maybe you're given the written case prior to the interview itself, and you're supposed to prepare materials, either just a memo or even potentially 3 presentation slides. And then the interview itself will be you going through the materials that you've prepared in advance. All of these are variations on the kind of traditional case interview, and you can always ask questions about what format you should be expecting. And the firm should be relatively straightforward with what you should expect. They want you to do well in these interviews too, because they want to see a good, strong version of the work that you're capable of performing. Once you're in the room, and here I want to transition back to thinking about traditional case interviews. The first thing you're going to do when you've entered into the case, all right? So we know it's like you might have behavioral, then you're going to have the case, then you might have wrap up. Now we're just looking at that middle part, the case itself. The first thing that's going to happen is the interviewer will read the case, read the basic facts in front of you. Your job here is to take notes and potentially think about some areas for exploration while the facts are being read. It's important then to repeat the facts. So to say things like, okay, let me get this right. I want to make sure I understand. Our client is a global genetics firm. They've developed a novel technology for bringing extinct animals back to life. And their question for us is whether they should develop a theme park assessing risks and potential rewards. Is that right? And the case interviewer will say, yep, that's it. Go ahead. Your next job is to ask some clarifying questions. So you might want to you might want to say, so just for the purposes of making sure our conversation is clear, is this a global firm or are we looking at a domestic market only? Or you might say something like, can I ask a little bit more about this genetic technology? Is it fully proven and approved, or are we still in the development pipeline? You might ask something like, does the firm have any information on customers that it anticipates that might be interested in this theme park, or is that something that we should discuss as part of the case? So a couple of clarifying questions. The consultant, the interviewer, will give you answers to these potential questions. We don't have any information on that. Yes, it's a good question. Our customers are science geeks who are interested in seeing dinosaurs, etc. And you can say, great, okay, thanks for all that information. If you don't mind, I'm going to take a moment just to get my thoughts organized. And that's your key to set up a framework. The consultant will say, absolutely, please take a minute and get your framework set out. You're going to take probably no more than 45 seconds to a minute to take whatever sheet of paper you've got in front of you and lay out what kind of framework you want to use to get this case cracked. And then you want to say, okay, so I think I've got my thoughts together. Let me tell you a little bit about how I want to approach this case. And then you say how you are going to think through the steps to get to an answer to this particular problem. The consultant will say, that sounds great. You know what? Hearing your case, I think that your assertion that we should start with market sizing sounds best. So let's talk about the market dynamics that you can anticipate. You say, fantastic. Let's start about the market. And then it's your job to ask analytic questions about the market size. So you might want to say something like, okay, well, the first thing I'd want to know is, based on the assumption that the market is science geeks, let's try to size that market. Let's try to think about who actually belongs there. So I'm going to make an assumption that, our primary demographics are going to be 18 to 35-year-old males who are super geeked about dinosaurs. I don't know. Could be your assumption. You might want to say, I think that it's actually, STEM fields have become much more inclusive. And so right now, it used to be the case that STEM students were almost 75% male, but through my knowledge about STEM careers and STEM fields, I know that actually the STEM fields are much closer to parity. So I want to focus on 20 to 25-year-olds in the United States. I want to think about individuals who have a STEM background, and I'm anticipating that total size population is something like 3 million people. Interviewers say, okay, fine, that sounds like a reasonable place to start. And then you want to ask questions about the assumptions that you're making. So the final part of this is to articulate what the cause of the problem is, or to recommend a solution or other answer to the challenge that's being presented. So in the case of the Jurassic Park, you'll go through your analytic questions, you'll get to a couple of answers, and at the end, you're going to say, okay, I think I have enough information to answer the client's chief question. Do you mind if I take 30 seconds just to get my thoughts organized before I present the conclusion? And the consultant will say, great, I'm so glad that you're going to do it concisely. And then once again, you're going to break and you're going to take 30 seconds and you're going to write down 1 or 2 potential solutions to the problem at hand. So you might say, and you're going to come back and you're going to present that as succinctly and efficiently as possible. So you're going to say, okay, based on our analysis of the potential market for a theme park that brings consumers into direct contact with dinosaurs, we make a recommendation to open this park, but to invest about $500 million in safety protocols to ensure that visitor experience is always secure. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about next steps, but to me, that's the answer that the client is looking for. Right? So I'm obviously making all of this up, but short, succinct, clear, and confidently communicated so that the consultant is very clear about where the client recommendation is. Okay, how do you prep for this? Like, this is all probably seems a little bit abstract. How do you actually prep for getting good at this? And I think that the best way to do this is not just to read cases, but to find partners. We've talked about this several times throughout the week, and actually talk through with one another. Now, I want to kind of feather this because Lauren Berger, who's a consultant still at Accenture, came and did a case prep workshop last year. She's an alumna from Barnard from not too long ago. And she suggested doing something called case starts. And I'm a big fan of this, having heard her pitch about this being an effective way to prepare for cases. So I definitely would always say that the number one best way to prep is to practice full cases with a partner. But in addition to that, I would suggest reading the top part of cases, essentially the facts of the case, with a timer. So you're going to read the facts and you're going to set a timer for like a minute. And you can fly through a bunch of cases this way. And there's so many cases in the Beyond Barnard Case and Consulting Club folder that you could do like 50 of these in a row. Read the facts, try to lay out your framework and some key questions, and then move on. And try to get frameworks down. Like, okay, this is a market sizing problem. Here are the elements. This is a profit problem. Here are the elements. And just try to get through as many of those as possible. Because essentially, on balance, getting a good start out of the gate with a case has the most impact on how you're going to proceed through it. If you get the framework nailed, if you know how to approach the problem, chances are your capacity to get through the case successfully go up tremendously. So that amount of prepping on the front end is much more valuable than probably prepping for any other part of the case. But these are just some other opportunities and ways to get good at cases. I'm a big fan of Investopedia still. I've been like a 15-year fan of Investopedia. For those of you who want a good primer on basic business lingo and industries, it's a great place to go to start. Caseinterview.com drills a little bit more into case interviews themselves. And actually, if you Google YouTube pop-up videos for consulting case interviews, there's some great examples of, essentially they're videos that you can watch case interviews happen, and the little pop-ups will tell you what's going well and what could go better along, so you're basically watching along. It's like a very old TV show that was called, oh my God, it was on VH1, which who knows if that even exists anymore. It's pop-up video, I think. But essentially, what you want to do is observe people doing case interviews if possible, and then practice live while at the same time doing case starts and just getting familiar with many of the different kinds of cases that are out there. Okay. A few things here on just preparing for actual, like if you are in the recruiting process right now and you are going to case interviews, just remember that case interviews are still interviews, that fit interview questions can still help you. Often because the fit interview portion of the case starts the case off, you can make a good impression. So, I can't say it enough, having the right kind of approach to behavioral interviews matters. I say interview attire matters still. I'm in a flower shirt today in my echoey room still, but I would say that really, so Beyond Barnard has a great a great virtual interview guide that I will attach to this evening's follow-ups. Basically, think about what you're wearing, think about your internet connection, think about the setup of your virtual space. If you're doing case interviews, these are important things to think about. And I would still say, even though we're all in our sweat clothes very often these days, it's important to dress the part as a consultant if you're going to be doing a virtual interview, and certainly in person as well. The last part, have the right materials, is super important. I think right now, a lot of people forget that when you go to interviews in person, you're often given a glass of water or a coffee or some pens and paper. And like in the virtual setting, like you have to bring all of that yourself. So make sure you leave yourself enough time before the start of interviews to ensure that you have the paper you like, the pens you like, and enough hydration to get you through what might be a really challenging hour or two. Okay, let's talk about another case, and I'm going to show you basically what the layout of what's in front of you, how a framework looks on a piece of paper as you're walking through a case. So Amity Island, I'm calling this case the Amity Hotel case. So the Amity Hotel was previously a profitable enterprise. However, recently, due to a series of unfortunate incidents with sharks, this is of course Jaws, profits have been declining. Help the Amity Hotel think about ways to recover from this downturn in business and to diversify its source of revenue. Okay, so I'm turning, instead of Jurassic Park, here's another summer blockbuster, Jaws. How do you help a hotel whose profits are suffering due to shark attacks think about returning to profitability? And here's an example of how I would lay out this case on a piece of paper in front of me. So from left to right, here's how it goes. Left is essentially the initial facts that are presented to me. The client is a resort. It was formerly popular until shark attacks, and they want to figure out how to return to profitability, thinking about diversifying its sources of revenues. So some clarifying questions that I might ask is, so can you tell me a little bit about the primary ways that the hotel generates revenue? Maybe something about its primary customers. Can you say anything about competition in the area? Are they suffering as well? Are they going through the same downturn? Do you have any info about sharks that's valuable? Should I know anything about sharks themselves? Most of those might be my clarifying questions. That might give me some information, and I'll say, great, let me get my framework laid out. And I'm going to do here what you're not supposed to do, which is really lay out a very simple profitability framework. So profit equals revenue minus cost. And you'll see the way that I've oriented this. First of all, this sheet of paper is in landscape. Lauren, in this great case prep, I just took some things from that last year that I am always going to continue to convey to students. The reason that you are using a piece of paper in horizontal orientation like this is because essentially what you're doing is preparing slides. You are basically, in the way that you're doing your job as a consultant, consultants, just like me, live in PowerPoint. And so her kind of assessment of what the case is essentially your layout should look like the kind of slide that you would eventually put in front of a client. So anyway, the way that the information is oriented is revenue is then price times quantity, cost is per unit number of units sold, and there are variable and fixed costs. And the way to move through the case is to ask questions in order down the page. So knowing that revenue is price times quantity, you might ask, okay, so I'd like to drill into a little bit the sources of revenue. How does the hotel actually make money? And they might say, okay, well, there are 3 ways that the hotel makes money. They obviously sell rooms to visitors. There's a small restaurant with a kitchen. And they also would like to explore conference revenue, ways to raise money by hosting events. Okay, great. So you want to explore then quantity. What is in terms of the quantity that each of these areas of business are driving, are rooms declining? Are they increasing? What about the rest of flow through the restaurant? And you might find, okay, they're going to say, obviously rooms are declining. People aren't staying here because the primary attraction is the beach. And so we're not getting people. Dining, however, is steady. We get day trippers from Boston, and those are the people who tend to come here to eat. And conference revenue right now is unexplored. Ah, interesting. Okay, so that might be one of the ways that you can generate new revenue. When it comes to cost, let's say per unit versus units sold, we're looking at variable costs mainly. So their biggest costs are labor and real estate. Let me kind of drive all this down. So if I'm on the interviewer side of the case interview, I might have a sheet of paper that has all of this information on it. So this is me withholding information from the interviewee. And through your questions, you should be able to get some of this information out of me. So if you asked, how does the hotel actually generate revenue? I would say, okay, right now the hotel generates money from rooms and food. The kitchen is pretty small and simple. Okay, interesting. Who actually then buys these things? Like who stays in the rooms typically, and who buys the food? You can say, okay, great. So you're asking about customers here. So our primary customers are summer families And our perception is that declines in revenue are due to a decrease in family traffic. Essentially, parents are really scared about their kids. But the thing is that Amity Hotel is only a 2-hour drive from Boston, so it's pretty close. Ah, interesting. Okay. Tell me more about sharks was one of my clarifying questions. And the consultant might say, well, listen, shark attacks are pretty rare, but they're sensational. And actually you can see sharks quite a bit if you go offshore a little bit more. If we, boat tours are big revenue drivers. If people want to go look at sharks, they just don't want to get eaten by them. Okay, interesting. So if you have a decline in revenue, maybe I want to explore ways to bring more of these people to the Amity Hotel for different kinds of reasons than they're used to coming here. Knowing that ad space is relatively cheap might be helpful, because potentially you could put ads in Boston newspapers or Boston websites and attract more people. In terms of like the actual infrastructure of the hotel, this particular case, the consultant might tell you, well, listen, right now the hotel isn't winterized, but it's fully owned, so they're not paying a mortgage anymore. So basically their only costs are upkeep, and there's plenty of space. It's a gigantic resort. A lot of the space is taken up by, just kind of rooms that haven't been renovated in a while. So from those answers to the question, you can get to, all right, well, listen, first I want to create an editorial campaign that educates family consumers on the low risk of shark attacks, drawing on experts and buying ads that emphasize proximity to Boston. So I want to promote Amity not necessarily just as a destination for swimming, but also to come and maybe look at sharks. Maybe I want to tout the natural beauty of the place, but really also I want to think about building a year-round conference business. We have all of this underutilized space. We have no mortgage to pay, so we can invest in renovations that can expand the space that we use for conferences. And it's a great revenue generator. We're close enough to Boston that people can drive 2 hours out. Firms can either make it a day trip, or they can put people up in rooms and have their conference here over the winter. So essentially that's a case. Those are two potential solutions to solve the Amity's problems. If it was a mathier case, what you might want to do is get into the nitty-gritty of what it would cost to winterize the hotel, what it would actually cost to place ads, and how much revenue you could potentially generate. Is it $500 per conference goer? Is it $1,000? There are different degrees of difficulty, and typically what you see in consulting is that in the first round, you might have a less quantitative case, especially in general strategy or management consulting firms. In more financially or technically driven firms, you might get more math in a first round. In later rounds, almost without exception, you get at least some basic math that you're going to need to do in the context of the case. So that is kind of a lightning round introduction to the shape of consulting case interviews, to why consulting firms use case interviews to evaluate clients, some ideas about frameworks that you can use to get started, some advice about connecting with each other for the purposes of practicing. But what questions do you all have? And like yesterday when we had a similarly small group, I'm going to stop the recording for now and say goodbye to our friends watching at home. Keep in mind, you can always schedule opportunities to do practice case interviews at Beyond Barnard. So be in touch if you need support and you're in the recruiting process. But otherwise, I'll see our friends at home later, and we'll open it up to Q&A for those of you who are here at the event. Bye, everybody.